Really? Like what the 3 pages that I saw you have to go through?
I can cover this in 90 seconds.
No, please drag it out. No, please. No, please don't do that.
I'm like, and then read, and then
Please don't do
I think I
that.
would have to do a mandatory weekend of rest for this group, otherwise
Yeah.
next week's like,
So, I promise you, it's a very wise thing to do.
I'm worried the wheels are going to fall off and have a meltdown.
Just call.
We have started. It's just that we don't see each other. Oh my word.
I've told them you started it, so can we make it?
No. We're waiting for ENCA. So.
Oh, okay.
T, you ready?
That's great.
You ready? Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning, South Africa. Good morning to the residents of Gauteng. Good morning to the world. It's actually a very momentous moment for us as ActionSA. My name is Lerato Ngobeni. I serve as the national spokesperson of the organization. And so we're very excited about this morning. I think that, I was just telling my colleague how historic this moment actually is. It can feel small, but it's actually quite a big moment. Some of us are looking forward to years from now when this moment will be recounted. And we're very grateful to all of you, particularly members of the media who are here to help us take this message to the world, and also more to South Africa and all of our delegates who will join us for the inaugural policy conference of ActionSA. I'm joined at this table by my colleagues. Perhaps I may start on my left. We have Samkelo Mgobozi, who has made sure that all of you are here. He is the National Director of Communications and my very close colleague. And then to my left is, next to him, is Coetzee. Is that your surname? I have to check. Coetzee is our chief strategist and has been very, very involved in the policy formulation process, which he will speak to just now. And then I will, to my right is our Chief Director of Governance nationally, Dr. Nasiphi Moya. And then next to Nasiphi is the National Chairperson of ActionSA, Mr. Michael Beaumont. Welcome, colleagues. I'm not going to speak for much longer. The way it's going to work is the first speaker will come through. We will do musical chairs, so do not worry. And then when they're all done in this order, Dr. Nasiphi Moya will speak first and give context to why we're here, and really, talk about this entire process that we've put together. And then she will be followed by Coetzee, who will speak to the policy process and how we got to this point. And then the national chairperson will close us off with his remarks. With that said, feel free to note down your questions, which we will use at the end of the process. And then, we won't ask them in between. And then you please make sure that you tell us who you are, which house you represent, and also who the question will be directed to. With that said, Dr. Moya, the floor is yours.
Good morning to the members of the media, the viewers and the listeners at home. As the national spokesperson said, good morning to South Africa. Yeah. And to my colleagues. The reason we're here, colleagues, I think the last time we were here, we were launching the policy conference. And I think at the time, we were not as tired as we look now, but we'll get there. But it is a very significant time in our party's life at the moment. All the members of ActionSA, I think when we said we want to fix South Africa, this is the moment that will define what we meant by that. So to us, it's not only an event that's happening next week, but it is more like us saying one thing and proving by our actions to say what is it that we promise South Africans. So the reason why we are here, we are briefing you about our much anticipated policy conference. We haven't been quiet since the launch of it when we were here. So today is just to make sure that we bring you on board on the details on what you can expect next week. So the conference is next week between the 12th and the 14th of September, and you are all invited. So we will be gathering in Gauteng. So all our members are coming here. So the policy conference itself is in accordance with our own interim constitution, which provides that every the year before a general election, that there must be a platform, which is the policy conference, where we adopt the policies that will be taking or that would constitute our offering to the voters. And so we're expecting 614 delegates from 9 provinces. The geographical representation is amazing. We're expecting people from Magagane, I think that is in Mpumalanga somewhere, somewhere in Limpopo in the rural areas, in the Karoo, in the Northern Cape. So we're expecting our members from all over the country, which is quite amazing in terms of the geographical representation that we're expecting. But more than that, colleagues, these delegates, ActionSA delegates, they will be deliberating on a set of thought-provoking and inspirational solutions that are aimed to realize our South African dream. In February, some of you may remember, we launched our South African dream. And obviously these policies, they follow what we have pronounced as our South African dream, which is our vision as ActionSA for an inclusive and prosperous South Africa. So obviously this policy conference follows a very rigorous participatory process, which obviously has become synonymous with us as ActionSA going back to our own roots of the people's dialogue. So talking is in our heritage as ActionSA. We're not scared to talk about things that will lead to solutions to fix our country. So, but the journey, obviously, it's been a 3-year, very intensive journey. You'd know that we celebrated our 3rd year last week on the 29th of August. So it did not only start when we launched, we had a media briefing, this policy conference. It follows that 3-year journey that as the party, with all the different elements that make up the party that we are. So obviously, in terms of what we've done since the launch that we had, the media launch of the policy conference, is that we have engaged our members of the party and supporters. And we have engaged industry experts, and my colleagues will talk more to that. We've engaged professionals, and we've engaged ordinary South Africans. This process has not only been about ActionSA and its members. We have been very deliberate to make sure that South Africans, when they listen to us and what we offer, they see themselves and their ideas and their inspirations in the offering of ActionSA. So we have also engaged ordinary South Africans in different ways and in different platforms. And the whole point was to basically gather insights and solutions that will address the most pressing challenges of our time as South Africa. I don't have to remind you what the issues are. When you today had a cold shower because load shedding started before I woke up. So I don't have to remind you of that. But in terms of since the launch that I've been talking about from the 11th of May, so what we've done is that we have engaged the public. And so we've launched that platform where the people that I just talked about engage with us. And we've reached out with a focus on 11 policy themes. And in terms of that, so those themes that which I will list for you now, just for your record, they will serve then as focal points at our policy conference. And obviously, once that is adopted by the policy conference, that is what we're taking to South Africans in the form of our manifesto. So what is important, colleagues, and I need to emphasize this point, is that the choice of these policies, obviously you know that there's more that can be, policy focused, but the choice of these policy areas is a reflection of ActionSA's prioritization of the challenges confronting South Africans. So in terms of the themes we're talking about, or the policy buckets we're talking about, we do have economic prosperity, energy security, economic justice, corruption, law and order, education, healthcare, public service, foreign policy, climate and environment, and the 11th one is rural development and traditional affairs. So in terms of the public engagement platform, we closed it on the 2nd of August. And obviously, our focus was to allow South Africans to play a very significant role in shaping our policy direction. But I think it needs to be repeated, colleagues, that what we attempted to do and what we strive to do as ActionSA is that our policy framework must reflect the aspirations and desires of all South Africans and not just politicians. So whatever we have done so far is to make sure that the mandate that we're given by the Senate of the parties to say we use ActionSA as a vehicle to serve South Africans and not politicians. And I think we've done a decent job in terms of fulfilling or realizing that mandate. Let me then hand over to Andre. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Moya. Andre?
Good morning, everyone. So as Dr. Moya explained, we have these 11 policy buckets that we have been dealing with over the past 8 months. And central to this process of developing our policies over these past 8 months has been a program of extensive engagement, both internally with our branch structures, which is of course key, but also a program that has been spearheaded by experts in the respective fields of these 11 policy buckets to make sure that we are developing a credible solution for South Africa that is enriched with the knowledge of people with first-hand experience of the challenges we face. I think for those of you who have been exposed to policies developed by other political parties in the past, often these are very much academic exercises based on a lot of desktop research, very well-researched documents with a lot of footnotes, but often they are entirely out of touch with the lived experience and realities that the South African people face. And I think something that has always been central to ActionSA's DNA is that we have never believed that politicians will bring the answers that we need to fix South Africa. As Herman has always said, Herman, our president, has always said, his knowledge of politics is dangerous. And I think the point is that one of the reasons for his success as mayor of Joburg is that he approached that position enriched with the knowledge he had developed as an entrepreneur and the success that he achieved in the business field. So when we set out to develop these policies, what we really wanted to do is make sure that we are getting a broad range of engagement, but predominantly spearheaded by experts. To this extent, over the past couple of months, since the first one on the 7th of June, we have had 14 expert engagements and stakeholder engagement sessions organized at a national level. And this has been supplemented by additional sessions that have been engaged by the provinces themselves. So we've had at least one session around each of the 11 buckets, and then additional sessions such as a dedicated session where we engage the agricultural community about the challenges they face and the ways in which government can assist them, and especially emerging farmers, to be more successful. The panels, I think, have been pivotal in this process because we've really been able to attract some very important, or I should say preeminent people in their field. Davy Root from the Efficient Group as an economist, Peter Fabricus, an independent analyst and journalist, Dr. Heather Tasmo, who's a political scientist at the University of Pretoria, who has also been central in trying to facilitate some of the coalition discussions currently happening in South Africa, and somebody's very live to the South African political dynamic. We've had Nick Headley, an independent analyst and journalist, giving inputs on our economic inputs, Clyde Mallinson, who's an energy expert, and Dr. Angelique Coetzee, who used to be the former chairperson or president of SAMA. I think this really just demonstrates the extent to which we've reached out to South Africans, but more importantly, their willingness to engage without having to be affiliated with ActionSA as a political party. I think behind the scenes then, We've had additional experts who've said to us, look, I'm not comfortable in this political climate to necessarily put my name and face out there, but as an expert, I really want to help you develop these projects because ultimately I share the objective of fixing South Africa. And I think that is something that has really struck me throughout this process in all our engagements, is the desire of South Africans, whether it's ordinary South Africans who just understand the challenges they live with, whether it's frontline service delivery workers who deal with these challenges on a daily basis, like doctors, nurses, policemen, and teachers, or whether it's academic experts who have an academic understanding of these issues. ActionSA wants to ensure that our policies are tangible, are credible, and are realistic, but more importantly, that they reflect the lived experiences of the people in our country and are not removed from them because they are developed simply behind a computer screen and then passed on to politicians who have never had the capacity or ability to implement something in a real-world scenario. Following the professional panels, which concluded in mid-August, we then also initiated a process of interprovincial policy panels, and this has been described by some of our delegates as the equivalent of commissions that you would see at some policy conferences. So we established an interprovincial policy panel for each of the 11 topics, and these were populated by 3 delegates per province and then led by one of our ActionSA senators. And the purpose of these interprovincial policies panels and the 28 members of that were really to receive all of these inputs from these various panels, so the online public engagements, the expert engagements, our branch level engagements, the expert sessions, and to synthesize that into a set of recommendations that can then be incorporated into our draft policies that were ultimately signed off by the Senate just last week. So I think throughout this process, it has really reflected ActionSA's DNA of engagement first. And everybody is familiar with our roots in the People's Dialogue, and I think this is not something that the People's Dialogue was ever approached as just a window dressing exercise, but rather a genuine desire to reach out to South Africa with the belief that the only way that we will fix our country is if we all work together to develop the solutions that we need to move forward and build the prosperous and inclusive future that ActionSA really envisions for our country. On that note, let me pass over to our chairperson to deal with the Senate resolutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andre.
All right, let me add my greetings to you all and dive straight in the interest of time. So with the policy processes concluded that my colleagues have referred to, these draft policy proposals came to our ActionSA Senate, where they had the responsibility to marry together the professional and expert inputs that we received and the party political inputs we've received from our structures across ActionSA. It's very important to note that ActionSA is no longer the party that we were 3 years ago. The party that we were 3 years ago, you could have sat everyone at this table. We now have 225,000 members. We have branches represented across 31% of the wards of South Africa, and it's a huge job to go and consult that widely and broadly. But bringing these policies together, our Senate did, and effectively a series of draft policy proposals were adopted by the Senate. And what's quite important to understand the nuance is that the Senate adopts a draft policy proposal, and that draft policy proposal goes out to all delegates. That is what will be discussed at our policy conference, and that is what is likely to be amended by the delegates at our policy conference. But what that draft proposal represents is the efforts to align the professional and party structure consultation phase. And from a point of view of public interest, let me just say that some of the things that have emerged from this process truly are going to be revelationary in a South African political landscape. So when you hear my colleague talk about the benefits of engaging South Africans who understand how the country needs to be fixed, you'll soon see why these kind of innovations are distinct in our South African political landscape. So firstly, we talk about a universal basic income grant as part of our economic prosperity package, which is projected by economists to create between 1.6 and 2.1 million jobs, and to grow our economy at a rate of 5% by pumping finances into our environment and ensuring that we can lift out of the economic depression that South Africa is in. We talk about repealing the BBBEE Act of 2003 and replacing it with a new suite of social justice policies, because ActionSA is opposed to the Act. We are not opposed to the empowerment of black people. We are fundamentally for the empowerment of people who have been disadvantaged by our unjust past. Part of that policy suite is what we call the Opportunity Fund, a fund that we will finance in unprecedented form that will tackle in the most aggressive fashion the investment in opportunity, in skills development, and in access to financing for small businesses, because we need grassroots level empowerment. We talk about a tough on crime approach that I think will be distinct, where, for example, the idea that life means that a person may never come out of prison to hurt another South African is a policy we want to look at from a point of view of minimum sentencing, where hard labor is a requirement of those who have hurt South Africans so that they may be involved in the process of rebuilding the society that they have so deeply harmed. And where more prisons are being built so that we never have a situation again where thousands of people are being released from jail for the sake of one person gaining their freedom. We talk about an aggressive rollout of clinics. There are too many people who cannot access hospitals in our country. They need clinics to provide primary health care. And we need those clinics to operate through extended hours, as was demonstrated by our President Herman Mashaba in his tenure of Mayor of Johannesburg, where so many lives were saved by people who could access that primary health care. We talk about an approach to rural development. The small towns and rural areas in South Africa are under siege from being derelict, being deprived of resources, and we need to offer people an opportunity that isn't just moving to cities, but a place where these rural areas can grow. And a big part of that has been our work with traditional leaders. ActionSA is unapologetically working with traditional leaders. Traditional leaders have been sidelined in our country. They have an important role to play, and they have been rendered as spectators by the ANC government, and this is something that we have to change. Beyond that, we are tackling an energy stability policy, which is something that is hugely important. We are concerned that the talk about ending load shedding is purely a cosmetic appeal put forward by the ANC for an election campaign. But here we sit in stage 6 load shedding, and we have been dealing with load shedding in this country for the better part of 16 years. If it is so easily ended just when there's an election campaign emerging, how can South Africans believe that load shedding will stay away at the end of the day? And that is why we need to ensure energy stability is a plan that we prioritize. We're going to focus strongly on immigration through a package that deals with improving our border patrols, the deportation of people who are in this country illegally and particularly have committed crimes, and the documentation of those people who should be in our country and should be documented, but are actually adversely affected by a failing Home Affairs that allows them to be exploited because of their lack of recourse in this country. And I think of a final note is a national year of public service, a policy we would like to present to all young people in this country who do not have a pathway to education and do not have a pathway to a job, to ensure that we can offer them a year of service in South Africa, particularly focusing in our police, our South African National Defence Force, our healthcare systems, and our education systems. I think ultimately we need more young people to gain the experience and the skills that will ultimately make them more competitive in a growing economy that will ultimately be the flagship of the ActionSA policy offering. So we move now to talk about our policy conference itself. I will be chairing that policy conference for the greater part of 3 days, along with a team. And effectively, this process emerges, as my colleagues have indicated, from our Constitution. It is important to note that ActionSA has grown vastly over the last 3 years, and part of that is a democratic maturation of our internal decision-making. The party that would have adopted policies prior to the 2021 local government election is vastly larger and needs to engage vastly wider. And that is why we will have 614 delegates, including our 91 public representatives that were gained from contesting just the 6 municipalities that we did. And they will be coming from not just the 9 provinces that my colleague mentioned earlier, but from every one of the 52 districts of South Africa and the 8 metros. And I think if you're looking for any demonstration that ActionSA is not a Gauteng party, and we're not an urban party, look to the fact that we can produce delegates who represent structures in every single corner of the 9 provinces of South Africa, because no emerging political party can do that. I think importantly, for the sake of members of the media and those who follow, the format of the policy conference itself may require a bit of attention. There will be a brief opening ceremony where we will certainly convey in key messaging what the approach ActionSA wishes to take to the South African landscape and the policy points of view, and certainly a keynote address by the President will be a feature in that regard. But from there, we dive into 11 key policy priorities that my colleagues have spoken about. And what must be said very clearly is that while elective conferences and rallies are something of a party where people come together and party, a policy conference is work. It's hard work. For 3 days, we will debate and engage. We will have experts presenting their views. We will table our policies. And already I can tell you that ActionSA members are keen to engage. Our Senate had the task of going through over 100 amendments to our policies that had been submitted over the last few days. And that just shows you the appetite of our delegates to engage and the love they have for their country. And we look forward to having those engagements very much. From a point of view of members of the media, I can also tell you that ActionSA is a party that likes to run on time. We will not be keeping you waiting for hours and hours on end, as you may be familiar in other operations. And we will stick to that program as much as we possibly can. But certainly you will experience an organization that is professionally operating. And I think for a moment, let me just talk about what this significance of this moment is. Because 3 years ago, there was a political party that could have met in an elevator. And 3 years later, there's a political party where 225,000 members were scrambling to be selected as delegates to this process. And I think from that point of view, we are coming together to engage on these policy solutions ahead of a national election where ActionSA is poised to emerge as the success story of that particular election. And where that becomes very important to us is that our Senate has recently concluded a strategic planning of our 2024 election. And among the things we have included, I will share one particular thought with you, is that ActionSA will be running a positive election campaign in 2024. South Africans are fed up of political leaders who talk about other political leaders and parties and not the issues that they face and the solutions that they need. And that is why ActionSA has resolved that our election campaign will not be spent talking about other parties. It will be spent talking about these solutions and offering them to the South African people. And it is our view that when ActionSA goes out and does that across every corner of the 9 provinces, voters and prospective voters will see a political party that is an alternative, and an alternative not just because it can win votes and it's diverse and it's growing and it's rooted in 9 provinces, but an alternative because it's talking to them about the issues that matter and not about other political parties. And that is what is going to be unique about this process, and that is why we have invested so hard in this policy process, because ultimately the very best thing ActionSA can do for South Africa is to be the biggest political party we can be emerging from the 2024 elections. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Chairperson Beaumont. Colleagues, the time is now yours. I will take the first round, second round, as you please. Just tell us, who you are, who you're representing, and who you are directing your question to. Take it away.
Okay, it's Kenny Mapaya from SABC News. Michael, I'm interested in your policy with respect to migration. Of course, there are different categories of migrants that are coming to South Africa, and we've seen through various efforts by the current administration that a lot of these solutions to solve migration challenges often is in conflict with the Constitution. So I'm interested in learning how the ActionSA political party intends to tackle it so that it doesn't infringe on that globally respected piece of legislation, but also addresses some of the concerns that South Africans have with respect to migrants.
Fantastic. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Can we do about 3 at a time, if you don't mind?
Gosnati Shazi from Power FM News. My question is on the governance issue. I just wanted to find out from ActionSA, how important will the governance issue be going into the policy conference? The reason why I asked that, I think last week or two weeks back, please mistake me if I'm wrong, but in Gauteng, ActionSA attempted a motion of no confidence. However, it wasn't supported by the Democratic Alliance. The Democratic Alliance is part of the
Party charter.
Yes, they are part of that coalition. So I just wanted to find out, did that pact not affect the policy going into next week's 3-day seating? So yeah, my question is around that and the potential infighting between your coalition partners. Thank you.
Okay, great. Zianda?
Zianda Ngcobo from Newsroom Africa. Mine's just a logistical question. What is the process of internally of choosing members who will become delegates at your conference? Thanks.
Okay. Michael, I'm going to take the last one. Go ahead.
Morning, everyone. This is Lerato Ngobeni from the SABC. I just want to piggyback on Bosnati's question about the DA essentially not supporting the motion of no confidence against the Joburg mayor. But also, there's a statement from ActionSA in relation to the increase in salaries for councillors, right? Essentially lambasting the DA for moving with the ANC to give effect to these salary increases, when in reality the Joburg residents do not see what these representatives are doing, you know, in terms of service delivery. And what does that mean if there is a disagreement at local level, but there's a pact that you wish to go ahead with in the 2024 elections? How do you see this playing out on a bigger scale? And I also want to ask about the, Michael, you said something about the BEE Act. You say you are for the empowerment of Black people, right? If that is the case, because this is what the Act purports to do or wants to do, what is it that you seek to change in relation to that? And is there necessity to change anything in that regard? Thanks.
All right, thanks. Michael, I think prosecute the first three, and then Dr. Moya will take the governance question from Power FM. Okay.
Who's going to tackle the last question about
The last question, I think you should, Michael. Did you get all of the questions? Do you remember all of them?
Yes, I've written them down. I'm very disciplined today. So I'll do my best, but I might ask my colleagues, particularly Dr. Moya and Andre, to come in and tag team, because I'm not the greatest policy guru in the world. Yeah. I learned a while ago you surround yourself with very strong people in that regard. So from that point of view, let me just start by saying that nothing that we propose in terms of reforming illegal immigration is in conflict with the Constitution, because the very first principle of a nation state starts with a border, and starts with the idea that a country has not just the right but the obligation to determine the flow of people and goods across the border and under what conditions. Certainly, I do want to say this, is ActionSA is very sensitive to the fact that we can never have a situation where immigrants are scapegoated for the failures of government. The failures in terms of illegal immigration belong at the door of government and nobody else. And that's where we will place those failures in the 2024 campaign. But certainly what our policy has to be very clear about is that our borders need to be guarded and protected far more closely, so that it isn't the free-for-all that is going on right now. That our ports of entry are being protected from what we know is passing through of illicit goods and illegal trade. And that certainly the documentation of people who are entitled to be in our country is taking place, because we must understand that so many of those people who are in this country without documentation, many of them are entitled to it according to our Constitution. And we wish to defend that right, because in many cases those individuals are then vulnerable to the worst forms of exploitation because they have no legal recourse. And it is in balancing that position that ActionSA unapologetically adopts the middle ground, the rational middle ground on the illegal immigration debate, and avoids the extremists on either side of us. And that is an important distinction we wish to make. From a point of view of governance, and I think we must just be quite clear about this because we want to talk unapologetically about ActionSA and our national policy offering. But our involvement with any other political party in a charter or a coalition doesn't change the fact that our policy process is distinct, it is unique, it is different, and that we will table policies that are unashamedly differentiated from that of even those people that we are in partnerships with. Because it is important to understand, colleagues, that when you sign up to a charter, you don't sign up to become clones of one another. You sign up to be your own distinct political party working in a collaboration. And that collaboration will never change the fact that ActionSA's offer will be distinct from our partners and will offer a political home to many South Africans who would not otherwise find it in the parties in that charter. And we make no bones about that whatsoever. And certainly from the point of view of what has taken place in local government coalition, we will be registering a number of views under our public service policy suite. That is one of the 11 items. We must understand that public service is one of the greatest areas where change can be delivered in South Africa. If you look at the amount of people working in the public service, the multiplying effect of having those people working in a manner which is aligned to strategy, performance managed on the basis of their work, promoting people for the right reasons based on their ability to do the job, are all critical functions to making local government and all other spheres of government work. And we will be presenting a number of remarks in that regard, and any political party that has failed to live up to their commitment to the South African people by refusing to support motions of no confidence, the likes of which we have seen last week, they must own that issue in their election campaign. We're going to own our campaign, and what our campaign says is that when ActionSA stands up and says we will be an alternative to the status quo, you will never find any contradiction in how we are that alternative. And that is the choice that the South African voters must ultimately choose from when they see how these political parties act, like we have seen in Johannesburg last week. As it relates to this issue of the increase of salaries, it is, certainly something that is hugely disappointing, but it's not surprising, because ultimately what we have seen is that the idea of a motion to collapse council, which was the excuse for why the motion of no confidence could not be supported, was ultimately a farce. We know it requires a two-thirds majority. If a party is not willing to negotiate a 51% majority, a two-thirds majority is just it's a circus. Let's call it what it is. And at the end of the day, it was just demonstrated, because now you've got the caucus of that same party who's now approving salary increases into the distance, and yet they don't plan for there to be a distance. It just demonstrates that it's not real. And I think perhaps the greatest insult to South Africans is a week after 73 people died in that fire. 1 week. You've got councillors in the city of Johannesburg rewarding themselves for the excellent work that they've done in their oversight duties and ensuring that the bylaws are enforced in our city. And I think that's the indictment that ultimately those parties must own going forward. ActionSA did not support that increase, and I'm actually very glad to see that if you look at news emerging out of National Treasury, it doesn't look like those increases will even happen as a result of the financial status of the national government. And then to deal with Zianda's question on choosing delegates, ultimately the Senate approved a framework. Our Constitution empowers the Senate to determine the framework around representation, the format of the policy conference, how policies are to be determined, etc. And that framework was developed. And what that framework required was that the provincial executive committees, working in close consultation with our regional executive committees, would ensure that delegates are selected from the different geographies, and to ensure that we have that diversity of geography in our delegations that ultimately will see people from the rural areas, from the cities, from the suburbs, from the townships, from the informal settlements and the CBDs, which I think is the trademark of ActionSA. And I think, if you don't mind, I'm going to hand over to my colleagues to guide us on terms of the specific questions that relates to BEE. I have a number of inputs, but definitely I think that they are better placed to guide you in terms of that answer.
Yeah.
Okay, so on the question of the repealing of the BBBEE, I'll just give an insight into the thinking of the Senate, how we got to this stage. I think the first recognition was the fault in the outcomes of that act. So there is a recognition that in the implementation of this act, since the amendment in 2003, it has produced very few billionaires, and the levels of inequalities, poverty, unemployment has gone up, which means the desired outcomes that the policy is talking about, it's failing to achieve those. And coincidentally, I mean, when people tell you about the story of BBBEE, it tells you who was the first beneficiary. A certain doctor was close to the late Nelson Mandela. And from there, we know that the people who have benefited from that act are people who are connected to the elite. So as Senate, we could not ignore that while the intentions of the act, they flow from the Constitution to say that we're going to redress the injustices of the past, we'll make sure that all lives will be improved in South Africa. This act is doing the opposite of that. In fact, it's leaving the majority of South Africans on the outside. So what we then, and I must say, colleagues, when it comes to the economic justice policy, it's something that as the Senate we had to pause because it was now talking to the issues that are close to the hearts and lives of South Africans. The survival of this country depends on that economic justice policy. We can talk economic prosperity, how do we deal with issues of infrastructure, but question is on a day-to-day, how do we deal with the human beings? How do we make sure that they survive? Hence, then you find the issues of making sure that South Africans have the opportunities, like the Opportunity Fund that Michael was talking about. The second thing is that while we looked at BBBEE as the policy that's going to redress the injustices of the past insofar as ownership is concerned, there is also a recognition that the failures of the past 29 years have compounded the problem, which is the legacy of apartheid in this country. So when you have a fees must fall, that is a sign that actually the acts like the BBBEE have not achieved their intended objectives. So we also had to consider that to say we're not only talking about the people who suffered from apartheid, we talk about the generation that comes afterwards. How do we then make sure that our policies speak to these problems, because we can't prioritize one problem over the other. As a result, then we decided when we look at economic justice as a policy, we're going to have to look at the broad suite of intervention areas. And it's important, and it's something that Michael said, that we recognize and we prioritize and we aim to empower Black people. There's no question about that. There's no way around it, because these are the people who are mostly affected by the legacy of apartheid, by the failures of government in the past 29 years. Question is, how do we objectively do that? And I think in the IPPP, which I coincidentally chair, as well as in the Senate, it was one of those very tough conversations that we had to have with each other, not only as ActionSA members, but as South Africans, to say, I may not have that problem, but my cousin has. How do we make sure that I don't leave my cousin out and I benefit, for instance? Hence, for us, we're saying in terms of the act itself, the way it is structured, it's not working because the outcomes of it is failed South Africans dismally. So that's what we are intending to do. When we repeal it, we don't want to entertain the policies of other parties. Hence, we are giving you a policy called economic justice that's then going to deal with how we intend to empower Black South Africans and other South Africans now that has been failed even in the past 29 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Moya. Colleagues, is there any question that was not answered? But I'll take yours, Muloko. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. I have a few questions. Firstly, since your founding, I do not remember you as the party going for an elective conference. Now, legitimacy is very important. Perhaps within your structures, because you have appointed people, my understanding is that your leader appoints people that he likes or who aligns with his views. Because he has made it clear that if you have a shady character, we can take you. Are you not concerned that as much as within your structures you might be happy, but perhaps South Africans, broadly when they look at you, they say, but these are not elected people. Shouldn't you have started there with an elective conference? That's one. Two, in terms of the basic income grants, I think this is one, another policy proposal that we have had even from the governing party as well. And they obviously want to start from the 350 rand that currently is being given to people who did not have jobs during the COVID-19. Do you have a figure in mind? Because a lot of people are saying 350 is just too meager. On the issue of a year of public service, are you talking of compulsory conscription here or not? And regarding the experts that you worked with, what were the criteria for identifying them? Did you focus on people who would agree with you? I'm just looking at David Wood. I'm just thinking that he would align with your free market economy predisposition. And lastly, on the issue of hard labor for convicted criminals. Already, these people have been punished. The fact that their freedoms have been curtailed, they are serving jail time. What form of hard labor are you mooting here when you look at the issues of Bill of Rights to say these are people who, even if they have committed some of the atrocious crimes, they still have the fundamental rights that are espoused by the Section 2 of the Constitution, which is the Bill of Rights. I just want you to be specific. This is how you want them to be subject to hard labor.
That's great. Thank you, Muloko. Let's get Andre to answer the questions around basic income grant, as well as the year of public service. And then Muluko's question on hard labor will be taken by Michael. And then I'll have two questions that are coming on from online, but I'll take those in the next round. So, Andre, please come through.
Yeah, so I'd like to start with the basic income grant. Firstly, make the point that we refer to this as a basic income stimulus, because I think the idea of calling it a grant speaks to that idea of that it is just a handout and that there is no economic, or there's no real positive economic impact on this, because a lot of South Africans may consider grants as just an expense to the country. The idea of an economic stimulus or a basic income stimulus is reliant on the economic concept of the multiplier effect, which I won't give you an economics lecture, but effectively to say that when you start empowering more South Africans with the funds that they need to participate in the economy, even just at a basic needs level, that money necessarily goes into the market, they purchase goods and services with that, and the long-term impact of that is that your economy grows, it creates jobs, it stimulates more business creation. So the idea of the economic stimulus package that we're proposing through the basic income stimulus is to link that to the poverty line. So there are 3 poverty lines that we consider in South Africa. There's the food poverty line, which is the lowest, which is basically the minimum requirement that you would need from a nutritional perspective. Then there's the lower poverty line, which is slightly higher than that, and then the upper bound poverty line. So while we will be unpacking this in a lot more detail at the policy conference, effectively what this will mean is that in year 1, because we recognize that the 350 Rand is entirely insufficient, you would start with a figure that is linked to the food poverty line. By year 2, when you've already seen the economic impact from this, so your GDP will start to grow, your economic activity will start to grow, it also becomes more affordable, you will then increase that to the middle poverty line. And in the third year, again, once that multiplier effect is compounded even further, you are empowered to lift that basic income stimulus up to the upper bound poverty line, which is approximately, I think at this stage, 1,455 Rand, but it's adjusted annually. So this is something that we do not necessarily foresee as a package or a stimulus that will be an indefinite program, but really what you want to start doing is ensuring that all South Africans have the ability to at least afford the necessities of life, and that one then relies on the economic impact on that to actually grow the economy. As Michael mentioned, I mean, the financial modeling that has been done around this, which is quite extensive, suggests that depending on exactly which scenario you implement, you can raise your GDP by about 3.5% to 5.5% over the period that the grant is implemented, and create somewhere between 1.3 and 2.1 million jobs. So we really want to emphasize that, yes, this has been mooted by other political parties, but framed as a grant. And I think for us it is far more important to recognize that the only real way out of poverty and inequality in South Africa is to create more opportunities for gainful employment. Because at the end of the day, no amount of money that the state can provide in form of social welfare will ever give you the kind of opportunity for upward social mobility that all South Africans deserve. So over time, what one wants to see is less South Africans reliant on a basic income stimulus package and more South Africans able to have a life where they can actually aspire to with a proper job and a family where we don't have to rely on simply social grants to meet a very meager quality of life. In terms of the service year, we are not proposing mandatory conscription, and I think this is an important distinction to make. As somebody that was born just after conscription came to an end, I'm very glad that I was never forced to go to the military. I appreciate that there is a generation in South Africa that associates conscription with discipline, with law and order. But I think the objective that we really want to achieve with our voluntary National Year of Service is to provide South Africans, and especially young South Africans who have come out of our educational system that has ill-equipped them to be participants in the economy. I mean, given our low pass rates, given the fact that the curriculum doesn't necessarily prioritize marketable skills or vocational skills, what we really want to create is an avenue for those young South Africans who don't have the means to go to university or the appetite to go to university, or who are simply undecided about what the next step is that they want to take in their life, and to then open up the public service to them in the form of the military as one avenue, certainly, but the police as well, whether they want to work as a fireman, whether they want to go and join the healthcare fraternity, or even if they want to do an internship in the Treasury, because they foresee that they may want to pursue a career in finances. But really what we want to do is direct that energy of young people who are eager to work towards frontline services where they can make a positive contribution to the nation, but at the same time earn an income and develop skills that by the end of the conclusion of that voluntary year of service, they will hopefully be in a better position to take up gainful employment or make an informed decision about what the future is that they want to pursue. So for those people who come out of university, who come out of high school at the age of 18 and already know what their path is, we're not forcing them to do anything. We believe if you have a path and you have the funding, you should pursue that. But I think for the majority of South Africans where that is uncertain, we want to give them an avenue that they can develop the skills and develop the knowledge and experience that will empower them for the following year. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you please take the criteria for experts?
Yes, so the criteria for experts, I think this is probably a problem of me mentioning the names that were at the top of my list, and I think in the statement, I think in the statement you'll find that there's a much longer and more extensive list. But ironically, we actually deliberately took the approach of not only approaching experts that were necessarily friendly to ActionSA. And for some of you who read the Herald, you might have noticed an exchange or two in that regard. We deliberately took the approach of actually trying to reach out to a broad range of experts. So for each panel that we convened, we probably sent out in the region of 30 to 40 invites. And in the end, ended up with probably 5 or 6 experts that attended. But really the idea was to actually try and get divergent views that would challenge us. And I remember specifically on the panel that we organized on law and order, which was chaired by our president, Mr. Mashaba. When he saw the list, he's like, oh, but these people are going to fight with me. I said, that's kind of the point. So really what we wanted to have is experts that would challenge our views. But I think by the nature of the political system and the nature of political affiliation, I think in more cases than not, we probably had people, at least on camera, who were supportive of our views. But it is also interesting to note that when we had the economic justice panel that was chaired by Dr. Moya, we had Mrs. Mashaba attending. And it was interesting that she outwardly stated, I don't agree with half of the experts in this room, but I accept your logic, I accept your rationale, and I think it's important that we have these debates. And I think the essence that she captured is really the entire point of this process, is that the experts were there to challenge us and in some cases guide us in a different direction. But yes, in other cases, they certainly affirmed what our core values were, and we were happy that they were in attendance. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael, I'm going to give it back to you, but I'm going to ask a question from Engineering News. And they ask to yourself, Michael, they ask, please ask ActionSA's comment on the inquiry established by Gauteng Premier following the Marshalltown fire. What does the party promise South Africans on the issue of energy? And if you can briefly explain as we are back to stage 6, Zianda. The next one is, I want to understand, this one is from the Sunday World. I want to understand the process moving from Herman Mashaba's suggestion for return of the death penalty, Andre, to the current proposal that a life sentence must mean exactly that, an inmate dying in prison. Also, what sort of crimes must be subject to the proposed life sentence regime? I think, Michael, this one piggybacks onto Moloko's question regarding the Bill of Rights.
In fact, I would suggest Michael deals with that.
With all of them?
Yeah.
Okay, Michael, are you prepared?
I am. I may
Fantastic.
want to tag Andre in from an engineering point of view. I always get nervous when engineers say it's targeted Michael. I'm going, oh dear. Okay. But yeah, let me tackle them as best I can. From a point of view of Maloko's questions on an elective conference, I think it's very important to say that it is correct. The democratizing of a political party is a critical component for its long-term longevity. If you consider what has killed incoming political parties in the past, it's been these issues more than the public-facing issues. But certainly where we are very sensitive as an organization is that the prospect of democratizing the decision-making of an emerging party is a process and not an event. You don't click your fingers and immediately dive in like a political party that's existed for a long time. You do it over time. And that is why this policy conference is a huge milestone for ActionSA. As I indicated to you, if you looked at the policy suite that was developed in our local government manifesto, it was ultimately adopted by 20-odd members of our Senate. Here we have a policy suite ahead of a national election that's going to be adopted by nearly 700 people. And that's just a demonstration of how ActionSA is undergoing a very rapid process to democratize its decision-making processes, because as the party grows and as the structures of the party establish in more and more places, those members need to find expression in the party, and that is the work that we are beginning with now. But as it relates to an elective conference, I often think that it is so often our opponents who focus in on this issue, because it doesn't seem to worry the members of our party, it doesn't seem to worry our supporters, and our opponents seem to really hone in on this issue. And if I judge the outcome of their internal elections, I'm not really necessarily sure they should be championing the outcomes of those processes either. But certainly we are having an elective conference next year after the general elections. It's codified in our constitution. It's publicly available on our website. I'm not sharing anything that's not already out there. because we recognize that that is going to be an important component to legitimizing the leadership structures of our party. But certainly, I think all eyes right now are on an election campaign that wins as many votes as possible. And we certainly don't need to go through a process like that to cause distraction to that important function in order to satisfy our opponents, who appear to be the only ones deeply seized by that issue. On the idea that our president appoints people who agree with him, I don't think anything further could be from the truth. I think every one of the people at this main table will tell you that the discussions that go on in our environment are, we are combative, we argue, we engage. Look no further to the question about the death penalty, where the president, by his own admission, has had a lifelong belief in the death penalty and the necessity for it in South Africa. It's been born of a frustration to see that victims of this country see no justice, and people come out of prison long before their 25 years to hurt more people. And that has borne that belief for him. But certainly it's the very process of surrounding yourself with experts inside and outside of the party that culminated in the perspective of saying, you know what, we need to understand that the country with the highest socioeconomic inequality in the world and a broken justice system is going to execute innocent poor people and let go wealthy, guilty people. And it was hugely important that we didn't make that mistake. And ultimately, if you want evidence for how our leader is not surrounded by people who, are an echo chamber for him and tell him what he wants to hear, that would be a very good example. As it relates to shady characters being told to leave our party, we don't apologize for that. They must go. I think there's too many shady characters in politics, and too many of them are kept. So whenever someone is found to be shady, they go. You won't find any political party in South Africa that is as decisive in the manner in which it deals with its problems as ActionSA. Because political parties can never guarantee that there won't be problems. All they can guarantee is how they respond. And I think in that regard, you will accuse ActionSA of many things undoubtedly, but being indecisive will not be one of them. And then on the matter of the hard labor, one of the things that we've discussed, and this is where our tough on crime policy is going to be unapologetic, is that wherever you go in these discussions in South African politics, the minute you talk about crime, we talk about the rights of the perpetrators. What about the rights of the people who've been harmed? What about society, who have been harmed by the actions of these violent criminals, who over and over again have proven that they come out of jail to rape and murder again? And we want the conversation to be about the victims of crime and the societies that are harmed by it. And when we say hard labor, why is it that South Africans every single day perform hard labor to get by? But criminals, you talk about hard labor, you're saying a human rights violation. People who have been involved in breaking the fabric of our society through their violent crimes must pay back. And one of the ways they pay back is through labor. And that labor must be involved in infrastructure programs and various projects like that improve society and do so in such a manner that it is affordable for our government to use that labor and to ensure that we can build that infrastructure. And we will put that policy forward unashamedly, because law-abiding South Africans work hard. Why should violent criminals not? And that's one of the questions we will be posing at the policy conference. On the issue of the inquiry, on the Commission of Inquiry by the Premier, to be dead honest with you, I think South Africans are fed up with commissions of inquiry, especially the kind that can tell you everything you need to know right now. Because there is nothing about what happened in Marshalltown that is not known to all of us in this room as we speak. And that is that buildings are being hijacked in the CBDs, that there is no bylaw enforcement taking place, certainly not since the departure of Herman Mashaba as mayor, that law and order has given up in those communities, and that ultimately the living conditions in that environment are dangerous, where slumlords are renting out tiny, inhumane spaces for high fees, often to the very people who don't have the documentation and the recourse to stop being treated that way. And that ultimately, when a fire breaks out, those people are vulnerable. We saw the issue of those gates that have been closed off that ultimately blocked people's passage to safety. And these are basic bylaw enforcement issues, where if the city of Johannesburg were operating in the way that it should, it would never have happened. And it's happening in many of our cities around the country. And that is why a key part of our policy input into this conference is to say that we need to take those bad buildings in our cities, we need to take those warehouses that have been abandoned, and we need to turn those things into opportunities for the South African people, for affordable accommodation, for spaces for small businesses to work, and that we need to turn these disasters into opportunities for South Africans, and that's a big focus of what it is we wish to do. Thanks.
Thank you,
Andre, can you please handle
Michael?
the energy
Yeah,
question?
Andre will handle that energy one. Come through. Do you remember the question?
Yeah, that's fine. Yes, thank you. I think as a point of departure, I think it's important to state that ActionSA's vision for our energy markets is for an open, competitive, and decentralized energy market. I think there is certainly an understanding that we need to break the monopoly of Eskom, and I think that process has recently started to come to life after the Minister of Public Enterprises signed the documentation that will eventually lead to the establishment of an independent distribution entity. But I think a lot of those solutions are solutions that will only really come to fruition in the long term, and I think load shedding is a crisis of now. I do think that it is possible, and ActionSA certainly thinks that it is possible that we can make meaningful inroads to this if we were to come into government today. Because I think one of the biggest challenges that we've seen is simply the political willpower. And I hate talking about the fact that policy is only about implementation, because it's not. But certainly if we've seen after the President made the commitment and he established the Minister of Electricity and spoke to legislation that would be adopted to make it easier for IPPs to come into the market and access the grid, none of that legislation has actually been passed yet. So in a short-term perspective, I think what ActionSA would do is certainly increase the incentives for private individuals to install PV or solar cells on their roof. I think the current rebate is far too low and frankly doesn't really help lower income individuals who can't afford to go off-grid via solar. I think that would also mean that government, instead of spending 3 billion rand a month on diesel to run the OCGT generators to bring load shedding down by 2 steps, the calculations were done that if government had spent that same money on providing solar panels to all houses in informal settlements, we would have dropped load shedding by approximately 2 stages on a permanent basis. And the thirdly is I think we just need to make sure that it is easier for IPPs, independent power producers, to access the grid. So grid reform is central to ending load shedding. I mean, we are aware of countless projects that they want to set up that are effectively shovel-ready and can get up and running in the next 6 to 18 months, but that they physically can't access the grid because the grid is not in a position to accept new generation capacity. So we're sitting with the Northern Cape where we can set up mass solar farms, but we don't have the infrastructure to connect those solar farms to the grid. So I think in the short term, we would certainly consider additional measures like the power ship deal, although we must also understand that any deal that you are going to use in the short term must be exactly that. It must be a 3-year contract with full transparency and not a long-term commitment that is more based on political kickbacks and patronage networks than really solving the energy crisis. But ultimately, the only real solution to the energy crisis is to make sure that we have a decentralized market. And when I talk about a decentralized market, it means breaking the reliance on Eskom and making it easier for independent power producers and microgrids to be established so that ultimately the burden on the demand of Eskom is decreased and that they are able to supply people and businesses that do not have the funding to go off-grid. So I think ending load shedding is entirely possible. There are solutions on the table. I think those solutions are common knowledge, but this is where a matter of the government needs to stop dragging its feet, put aside the considerations about unions, and actually just put the benefit of the overall South African economy first and foremost. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre. Michael, there's a dissatisfaction here online. Please come back. We aim to really respond to these questions. This one, Michael, it relates to the hard labor issue It's Sunday World. They are not satisfied that you do not necessarily elaborate on the types of crimes that people would have had to have committed to be, compelled in this way. And also, they want to know, and I think they want categorically for South Africans to know whether the Mashaba's call for the death penalty is off the table altogether. Please, can you give that assurance? Thank you.
Sure. Andre, do you want to perhaps take this to our assistants here?
Which one?
The details around hard labour and for which crimes, etc.
Right.
If the Sunday World was dissatisfied with me, I'll offer them Andre.
I'm not sure I can provide the
Andre,
necessary.
please make sure.
Some of these things, and I must emphasize this point throughout, that the draft policies are draft policies, and subject to the process of amendment that Michael mentioned, and also subject to deliberation and adoption by our policy conference itself. I think the point was, and when one considers this in the larger context of not only the death penalty, but I think something that the experts also raised and many people raised throughout the engagement process, is that really what lacks in South Africa is a culture of consequences. And I think this comes from even just being a resident of Joburg, where if you are caught by a speeding camera, the likelihood of you ever having to actually pay that fine and having a consequence for that fine is effectively zero. I say this having worked in the city of Joburg, where they wrote off 400 million rand of fines as bad debt because they knew they were unenforceable. And if we have a criminal justice system where consequences are non-consequences, or where a fine for a corrupt act is far less than what the proceeds of what that act would generate, effectively you saying that the cost of crime is the cost of doing business and there's no deterrent.
pictures.
As in right now. I'm not going back to the table.
No, I have to file.
Busy, ngiyaqoqa, isulunjuluko, busy uyangishuta. Uyangididiyela.
One-on-one. You know what Shapa did what change on this now that basically going on holiday.
Prison is not as hard as we think. These guys, they do their fees, they do statuses. They are chilling out. No, not even just that. Some places like extreme. I'm not like this. I'm not tell you that hanging out on my face.
Yeah, can I just read off anything quickly?
Cool. Andre will come to you and I'll bring Michael after. Did you get it this morning?
I didn't read it, I just saw the headline.
It's short anyway.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Victoria.
No, I'm in the French done.
So you really have to. Have you used the stairs on the council chamber and go down a few steps?
Yeah, the purchase is down.
Someone's calling you. Looks like spam. Looks like spam though. I know that's